I was never good at starting conversations. I always thought the right words would come naturally, that the right moment would arrive on its own, that there was a perfect time to say the things that mattered. And I kept living that way, waiting for the right moment, until I realized that the right moment doesn't wait for anyone. There's a call I didn't answer. It sounds simple when you say it like that. A missed call. It happens every day, to everyone. The phone rings, you're not available, life goes on. But that specific call, with my father's name on the screen, it's been burned into my memory in a way I can't erase. I saw it. I chose not to answer. And then I chose not to call back. That wasn't an accident. It was a decision. And it took a great deal of pain for me to understand the difference between the two. What I'm about to tell you isn't a story about one day. It's about an entire lifetime of similar days, of silences that accumulated like sand in an hourglass, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly time ran out and you realize there's nothing left to do. My father's name was Robert. He was a man of few words and great presence. When he walked into a room, people noticed. Not because he was loud or attention-seeking. It was the opposite. It was because he was solid, steady. He had that kind of posture that makes you believe nothing in the world could ever move that person. And for many years, I believed that. We grew up in a middle-class home, in a neighborhood in a small town. My mother took care of the house and worked part-time. My father worked a lot, left early, came home late, sometimes ate his dinner reheated. It wasn't neglect. It was what he understood as responsibility. Providing was the way he knew how to love. But loving in a way the other person can't recognize sometimes hurts more than not loving at all. He never called me stupid, but he never called me smart either. He never said I was weak, but he never said I was strong. He stayed in the middle, in that neutral territory where you never quite know where you stand. And children need reference points. Teenagers need mirrors. I grew up never really knowing what my father saw when he looked at me. Sunday lunches were our ritual. My mother cooked, the family gathered, and we talked about soccer, about work, about news nobody was really interested in. It was the kind of conversation that exists to fill silence, not to create connection. We saw each other, but we didn't really see each other. I got used to it. It's remarkable what we normalize when it's the only reality we know. When I was in my early 20s, I started noticing I was repeating patterns. I dated a girl for 2 years and never told her I loved her. Not because I didn't, but because the word got stuck before it could come out. I lost friendships because I didn't know how to apologize. I was good at silence. I was good at ignoring. It wasn't that I didn't feel things. I felt too much. The problem was that between the feeling and the expression, there was a wall. And I never understood where that wall came from. I only found out when my son was born. Lucas came into the world on a rainy October afternoon, the kind where the hospital has that yellow light that seems to filter time itself. I was outside the delivery room because I had fainted, not from fear, but from an emotion my body couldn't contain. When they let me in and I saw that small, red, screaming baby, screaming as if the world were unjust, and it was. He'd just left somewhere warm and dark for somewhere cold and loud. I felt something I had never felt before. Immediate love. Unconditional. Unquestioning. And right after, enormous fear. What if I don't know how to show him that? I called my father from the hospital. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "It's a boy. Lucas." He was silent for about 5 seconds. The kind of silence you learn to read when you've known someone for 30 years. And then he said, "Take good care of him," and hung up. He didn't ask how much he weighed. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't say he was happy or proud. At the time, I was angry. Today I understand. It was the only way he knew how to say he was too emotional to speak. Lucas grew up being everything I wasn't in childhood. Hugged, praised, listened to. I committed from the very first day to doing things differently. Every night before bed, he could tell me anything. Every achievement, no matter how small, I celebrated. When he made mistakes, I talked to him. Didn't yell, didn't punish with silence, didn't turn my back. I thought I had broken the cycle. I thought it was just a matter of wanting to and doing things differently. The first serious fight with my father happened when Lucas was 4 years old. It was at a Sunday lunch. like always. My father made some comment about how I was spoiling the boy, said children need firmness, that too much affection creates weakness, that I was raising a crybaby. I didn't hold back. I replied that affection wasn't spoiling, that children need emotional security, that the research clearly showed that secure attachment develops more resilient people, not less. I kept raising my voice as I spoke. My father raised his. My mother tried to change the subject. Lucas sat still with his spoon in the air, looking back and forth without understanding. The argument lasted 10 minutes at most, but the silence that followed lasted months. He stopped calling. I stopped too. My mother stayed in the middle, trying to build bridges we refused to cross. I saw my father at lunches because my mother insisted, but we barely looked at each other. I talked to her, to my brother, to anyone but him. It's curious how two grown men can be in the same room for hours without exchanging a single direct word. It's almost a skill. 3 months after the fight, my mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at work in the middle of a meeting and I stepped out to answer because she never called in the middle of the day without a reason. "Your father has been different," she said. I asked what she meant by different. She was vague, said he was too quiet, that he'd been going through old papers, that he'd asked her to show him where the life insurance was, that one night she woke up and he was sitting on the porch at 2 a.m, staring at the street. I listened to everything and said, "Mom, he's always been like that. It's just his personality." She was quiet for a moment and then said, "It's not the same. It's different," and hung up. I went back to my meeting and tried not to think about it anymore. I mostly managed. But that night, as I was trying to sleep, I kept going over what she'd said. Old papers, life insurance, 2 a.m. on the porch. Were those signs? Or was she being dramatic? And then the calls started. My father would call and hang up. Call and hang up. Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes at the end of the day. Calls that lasted 2-3 seconds. Just enough time to see the name on the screen, not enough time to answer. As if he'd dial and regret it before I could hear his voice. As if he wanted to talk, but didn't know how to begin. I never called back once. I say that with shame, not pride. At the time, I convinced myself he needed to make the first move, that he was older, that the fight had started because of him, that he was the one who needed to apologize first. That's the logic of pride. It always finds a reason not to give in. For Lucas's 5th birthday, we had a small party at home. Simple, close family, a few kids from the neighborhood, a chocolate cake my mother made because Lucas had specifically asked for hers. It was a beautiful afternoon, the kind you keep photographing because you sense you need to hold on to it. My father showed up. Without warning, without being invited. My mother must have told him, even though I hadn't asked. He arrived with a present wrapped in newspaper because he never knew how to wrap anything properly. With that way he had of entering a room as if asking permission just through his posture, without ever saying a word. He stood in the corner of the living room, ate a piece of cake, watched the children play. Lucas, who carried none of the weight of that adult war, ran and hugged his grandfather around the waist as if they'd seen each other just last week. And it was in that moment that I saw what my mother had been trying to tell me over the phone. My father went rigid for a second, that second of someone who doesn't expect affection and doesn't know what to do when they receive it. And then something gave way. His shoulders dropped. His hands, which had been at his sides, moved slowly to Lucas's head, and he closed his eyes. It wasn't the posture of a hard man ignoring his grandson. It was the posture of a man who was holding something inside and used that child's embrace as an anchor. After that, he tried to approach me twice during the party. The first time I was talking to my brother and pretended not to notice. The second time, he stood next to me for about 30 seconds without saying anything. And I didn't say anything either. And then he went to get another piece of cake. That night, after everyone had gone home and Lucas was asleep, my mother sent me a message. "He wanted to apologize to you today. He couldn't, but he wanted to. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I replied, "If he wants to apologize, he can come and say so. I'm right here." I put my phone away and went to sleep with the clear conscience of someone who thinks they're being reasonable. It was only much later that I understood that reasonable and right are not always the same thing. It was 6:43 in the evening on a Thursday when my phone rang with his name on it. I was in the car in the supermarket parking lot, waiting for my wife to finish shopping. I had picked up my phone to check email, and suddenly it appeared. Robert. Dad. I stared at it for about 5 seconds. The phone kept ringing, and I kept staring. It wasn't anger that made me not answer. It wasn't resentment, wasn't about the fight. That was old history by then. It was something more numbed than that, a kind of exhaustion, a feeling of, not now. As if there were a right time for that conversation, and that time simply wasn't now. I let it go to voicemail. My wife came back with the grocery bags. We drove home. I made dinner, put Lucas to bed, watched television for an hour, and went to sleep. At no point did I call back. At no point did I think, I need to return that call. I simply didn't think about it again. 40 minutes after I'd turned out the light, my phone rang again. It was my mother. She didn't say hello. She said his name, Robert, and her voice was different. That kind of voice you recognize before you understand what the words mean. And I already knew, before she finished the sentence, that something had changed permanently. He had collapsed. His heart. Emergency room. ICU. I remember getting out of bed, grabbing my keys, leaving without saying more to my wife than, "It's my father," getting into the car in the cold of the early morning and starting the engine. And I remember the thought that wouldn't leave my head as I drove faster than I should have. What if that call was him trying to say goodbye? Hospital hallways have that specific smell. Alcohol, air conditioning, a cleanliness that's almost too antiseptic, that makes you feel like the place was designed to strip out the scent of life. My mother was sitting in a faded blue plastic chair, her purse in her lap, shoulders curved, eyes red but dry. She had already cried the part she had to cry before I arrived. She stood up when she saw me. She hugged me. And when she pulled back, she was holding a brown envelope, one of those craft paper ones, with my name written in pen in my father's round, careful handwriting. The handwriting of someone who learned to write in public school decades ago, where neatness was required. "He asked me to give you this," she said. "A few weeks ago. He said only if something happened." I held the envelope without opening it for a long time. I stood in the hospital hallway, envelope in hand, unable to tear it open. As if opening it would make everything more real than I was prepared to bear. I went to the bathroom, walked into a stall, sat on the lid of the toilet. It's not a pretty image, but it's a true one, and opened the envelope. There were 3 sheets of lined paper, handwritten, front and back on some of them. The handwriting was steady at the beginning and grew more irregular toward the end, as if he had written it over several days, at different moments, with different emotions. He started by saying he had never been good with words, that this was something he had known about himself since he was young, but had never managed to change. That his father had been the same way, the grandfather I barely knew, who died when I was 6, and that he had grown up believing men didn't need to talk, that physical presence and providing were enough. He wrote that the day I was born was the most frightening day of his life. Not because he didn't want a son, he did, desperately, but because in that moment he understood he was responsible for a life, and that he had absolutely no idea how to do that, and that the fear never fully went away. He wrote about the fight. He said I had been right about Lucas, that he had only realized it months later, that he had thought it over and come to the conclusion that I was raising my son better than he had raised me, and that it hurt in a strange way. Not with pride, not with anger. It hurt with regret, with everything he hadn't done differently. There was a part I had to read 3 times to absorb, I tried to call you many times. I would dial and hang up because I didn't know what to say. I never learned how to apologize. I learned how to work, to provide, to be present in body. But I never learned to open my mouth and say what I felt. I came to your house for Lucas's birthday because I wanted to find you. I stood next to you, waiting for you to look at me so I could say something. You didn't look. I left. I called again last week. You didn't answer. I understood. But I need you to know. I am proud of you. I always have been. And I regret never saying it out loud. I drove to the hospital in 15 minutes. I spent 30 sitting in that bathroom stall. My father spent 12 days in the hospital. The situation was serious at first. There was real risk, but he was stubborn. And stubbornness is sometimes the way the body finds to keep going. He improved slowly, moved from the ICU to a regular room, and on a faint winter morning was discharged with a list of medications, dietary restrictions, and instructions he would follow with the same discipline he applied to everything in life. To the letter. But something had changed between us. Not dramatically. It wasn't as if we suddenly became a father and son from an American TV show, hugging and crying and saying, "I love you," every time we saw each other. It wasn't that. It was more subtle. It was a different look. It was him asking how I was in a way that seemed like he actually wanted to know the answer. It was me calling him in the middle of the week for no particular reason, just to talk. We never spoke directly about the letter. It existed between us like a conversation that didn't need to be repeated out loud because it had already been said in the most honest way possible. He lived 4 more years after that. 4 years in which we made more real connection than in the 30 that had come before. Not because we resolved every problem, we didn't, but because we stopped pretending that silence was peace. He died on a Sunday morning, lying in his bed at home, next to my mother, without suffering. He was 72 years old. My mother said he woke up that day in good spirits, ate a full breakfast, said he wanted us all to have dinner together that Sunday. And then he lay back down and didn't wake up again. I was the first to arrive when my mother called. I walked into the room, looked at him, and the first thing I felt, before the grief, before the tears, was gratitude. Gratitude that I had said what needed to be said while there was still time. Gratitude that the last conversation we had, the day before, hadn't been about soccer or the news or anything shallow. It had been about Lucas. He asked how his grandson was doing at school, and I told him, and he listened with that attentiveness he had developed late, but developed genuinely. And at the end he said, "You're doing right by him." Those were the last words he said to me. Today, when my son does something wrong, I breathe before I speak. That sounds small. It isn't. That 1 second of breathing is the second my father never had, but never used. It's the second between impulse and response, between reflex and choice. When Lucas hugs me, I hug him back with both arms, firmly, long enough for him to feel that it's not an automatic gesture. When he tells me he loves me, I look him in the eyes and tell him I love him too. Not because someone taught me it was important, but because I know, in my skin and in my memory, what it is to grow up without it. There's a question I ask myself sometimes, as a kind of brutal honesty exercise. What if I had answered that call? What if I had called back? What if, that night in the supermarket parking lot, I had pressed the green button instead of letting it ring? The honest answer is, I don't know. Maybe we would have talked. Maybe he would have said what was in the letter, out loud, his phone trembling in his hand. Maybe I would have heard "I'm sorry" that night and saved us years of accumulation and a midnight drive to the ICU. Or maybe not. Maybe we would have sat in uncomfortable silence on the phone and hung up without saying anything important. Sometimes the lesson doesn't come from the moment we choose. It comes from the moment we almost lose. What I know is this. What destroyed years of my relationship with my father wasn't hatred. It wasn't a betrayal, wasn't violence. wasn't something beyond repair. It was silence. It was pride. It was the sum of infinitely small choices to not speak, not call, not give in, not be the first to say. And silence seems small, seems harmless. It's an absence. How can we be afraid of an absence? But silence grows. Silence takes up space. Silence fills the cracks of a relationship until one day you look and can no longer find the person on the other side. I almost lost my father without ever having truly found him. And the only thing that saves me from that, the only thing that lets me sleep without that weight in my chest, is knowing that in the end, in that ICU room in the middle of the night, we found each other. Late, but in time. This lesson, the cost of silence, the weight of pride, the urgency of love spoken out loud. I will not let die with me. I will pass it on to Lucas. He already knows how to say he loves someone. He already knows how to hug for real. He already knows that apologizing isn't weakness, it's courage. Maybe he'll pass it on to his children one day, and they to theirs. And at some point, this chain that began with a grandfather who didn't know how to say what he felt will finally break. That is the only inheritance worth leaving.